Hello, good afternoon. So, yesterday I recorded a short about how a cult uh, isn't always a cult at first. And I promised a longer form video about sort of red flags to look out for in your yoga communities. So a little bit more about my history, and as I record more videos, I'll share more about my history. But I've been in a few yoga cults, and my first one was in 2001, and a few years later, then is when I started going to Mysore and I found myself in the Ashtanga cult. And so, what I'm going to talk about is how to recognize the signs and the patterns because they're the same. Um, and how the way that we have been brought up to understand cults is very different than the reality of cults. So, for years, I didn't think that Ashtanga was a cult. I thought that uh, and I would ask myself, and these are conversations that I would have with my friends and my colleagues in Ashtanga yoga. I would say, hey guys, are we in a cult? And we would always come to, well, no. I mean, sometimes we would talk about it and we would talk about maybe some of the similarities with cults that we had been familiar with. But in the end, we decided that Ashtanga was not a cult because more or less we had a choice. We could leave anytime, and that the level of control was, minimal, if any, really. And now I look back at that and it's a little laughable because I think at the time I was holding it up to what were the more obvious cults like Jonestown or something like that, where it seemed like the level of control was very high. But one thing that I didn't equate to cult behavior or activity, and one thing that I never actually really bought into entirely, is that Joyce, Patapi Joyce, and equally Sharat Joyce would shame us for gossiping. And they would say, don't gossip, just do your practice in the morning and stop gossiping and, whatever. And at the time, I thought, well, that makes sense. Gossiping is negative, at least it's socially perceived as being negative. And as yoga practitioners, maybe we should be more evolved than that. So, yeah, okay. Except the thing is that gossip, uh, it isn't just petty drama. It serves a really important purpose within communities where there is no formal accountability, like yoga communities. Gossip in these communities is a mechanism that helps to regulate behavior, again, where there is no accountability. There are no systems in place. It's how communities can compare notes. It's how we can come to realize, wait, that happened to you too. And when he told us to stop gossiping, it wasn't that he was teaching us to be more spiritual, although he certainly presented it that way. What he was essentially doing was cutting off the one mechanism we had to name what was happening, to understand, to protect ourselves, to protect each other, to build collective understanding. And this is how cults work. Not through chains or complete control. Cults work through shame. And it's very subtle, but very effective. Cults make you police yourself and police others. So in 2004, which was my first trip to Mysore, and which is when I witnessed Patabi Joyce sexually assaulting students, I was having conversations with anyone that would listen. Many people, both students and teachers, some famous, some not, were really ashamed, would speak to me in like hush hush, like they knew that they were going against this invisible code that Patabi Joyce had been shaming them and conditioning them for years, some even decades, to not speak to each other. So it was very hard to have real, honest conversations. One or two people were able to have honest conversations, but for the most part, the conditioning by the time I got there was so deep that even when they were describing sexual assault to me, they would then excuse it with, I don't know, or will never understand the guru's ways, etc. But here's the deeper question that I should have been asking, and that we should be asking ourselves now, is why are we relying on male priest class for our spirituality when certainly as women, we're not even considered in the blueprint of it? These systems were designed by the male priestly class for men. Women were never the center. They were never part of its original design. We were the ones that were doing the care work in the back of the house, so to speak. We were the support staff for these men to be able to reach their deep meditative states and transcend the body. It was the women that were serving, cleaning, cooking, raising their kids, etc., so that they could then tell us what spirituality was like. I couldn't think of anything more incompatible with my life. That's just so funny. And, there are female deities, yes, and people will say, but there's, Saraswati and the female deities, and they're an afterthought. Y'all, they're decorative. There's something to bow to in ceremony, but they're not they're not central to its structure. They're never actually honored in a way that power is actually, that they're part of that power that is being distributed, or whose bodies are even being considered as sacred, you know? Women's blood is dirty, impure, but we kept showing up. We kept bowing. I certainly kept surrendering to the system that never even had me in mind. That to me is a more interesting question. Anyway, so going into kind of what to look for, red flags. Here are 8. Of course, there are more, but let's get started. So, the first is that you're going to have, of course, a charismatic leader. This is going to be a man. It might be a woman. Generally speaking, if it is a woman, she is reiterating what the men have said before her. Now, this charismatic leader doesn't have to be handsome, doesn't even have to be funny, but he will claim a unique lineage or direct transmission from enlightened masters. I've studied with, blah, 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 blah. And so they create this mystique around their knowledge. The red flag here is if you can't verify their credentials or the lineage independently. So coming back to the first cult that I was in 2001, years after I left, students tried to verify. He claimed to be a lineage successor to Swami Satyananda and Swami Niranjanananda Saraswati of the Bihar School of Yoga in Bihar, India. Years after I left, students at the time tried to verify his credentials, and the response they got back was no, more or less, he's not who he says he is. So red flag, like I said, is if you can't verify their credentials or the lineage independently. The second one is that the practice is perfect. You are the problem. Why are you such a problem? Any discomfort, injury, or doubt is your ego, your resistance. You're not ready for this teaching. Blame is always on the student. It's never on the system. In 2004, that my first trip to Mysore, there were women that were leaving immediately, cutting their trip short because Patabi Joyce had sexually assaulted them. Now, when I would talk to other teachers that had been there longer, because I was really curious as to, this is what I'm seeing, this is what's happening. Are you not seeing it what are you doing? What is happening here? I was really trying to make sense of everything. And I would say, so and so just left and went home because Patapi Joyce assaulted her. And the response, certainly from the older teachers at that time, were, oh, well, she just didn't understand Patapi Joyce's adjustments. There's spiritual transmission happening there, et cetera, et cetera. So it was her problem. So the red flag here is that your valid concerns are reframed as spiritual failings. And that comes into another point that I'll get to later on. The next one is financial exploitation that's always disguised as devotion. So if you were really dedicated, you would go to Mysore. If you were really dedicated, you would go to all the tours. If you were really dedicated, you would fill in the blanks, go to the retreat, go to the workshop, go to this, go to that. So it's constant workshops, training, advanced offerings, questioning your commitment, challenging your commitment, pricing that keeps you maybe financially dependent or stressed. Patapi Joyce used to really fuck with students financially. He would be counting the money in front of you. You'd be counting the money that you just gave to him. And he would say, there is not enough money. You have to go get me more money. And some older teachers, would say, oh, he's just such a nut. He's just this crazy uncle. He's got such a funny sense of humor. Some would be furious at the fact that he was financially devious, uh, dishonest. So there was that extreme between students that saw that as the guru testing you, and some that saw it as just him being a straight up gangster. And later, certification, what I last heard was that the cost of being certified was like $30,000 or something. I'm not sure if that's true. Certainly to study there, it was a very expensive place to study yoga. So it was certainly not inexpensive. And the way that we justified it as students is that we would compare it to a college degree or a college education. Certification was more like a PhD. But y'all, get your shit together. This is yoga. This is not a PhD. Anyway, so financial exploitation, meaning either you can't progress in the hierarchy of it or you can't progress spiritually without spending thousands. The next one is information control. You're discouraged from studying with other teachers. They don't understand the real practice. And criticism of the teacher or the system is completely forbidden. So loyalty here means not questioning or seeking any outside perspective. Uh, so the red flag, again, I mentioned it earlier, but loyalty means not questioning and not seeking any outside perspectives. Which brings me to the next point, which is isolation from outside relationships or isolation from other perspectives. So, your regular friends don't get it. You're waking up at 2 in the morning, you're practicing, your friends are like, that's stupid o'clock. Why would I do that? The community ends up being your entire social fabric. And the red flag is that you're spending less time with people who knew you before. Another red flag is that your confessions are become weaponized, and are used as a form of control. Now, I didn't really experience this in Ashtanga, but I did experience this in the first cult that I was in, where when you share vulnerabilities with the community under this umbrella of sacred space, these vulnerabilities are then later used against you, either to tease you, make fun of you, put you down. It's always framed as something that is intended for your spiritual growth. And if you question anything, then it's really weaponized against you even more so. And then you come back to my previous point of, well, you're just not ready. So the red flag here is that your confessions, your discussions, your vulnerabilities under sacred spaces are held against you and weaponized. The next one is that the guru's body, the guru's mind, is the authority. So for Ashtanga yoga, it would be the physical adjustments without consent, right? Where touch becomes a privilege and or a punishment. When uh, One thing that's really interesting about the Ashtanga method and the way that it was taught in Mysore is that we didn't really know when new postures were going to be taught. The students and the teachers created a sort of tale, a legend around it. In my opinion, it was to help us make sense of what didn't make any sense, of what was completely arbitrary. For some people that came, that maybe it was their first trip or they were sort of brand new to the system, they would see it right away and they would call bullshit and leave. But for those of us that had really invested time and energy, we needed it to mean something. I needed it to mean something. For example, I was not taught a new posture for about 8 years, even though I went to Mysore every year, sometimes twice a year. Now, I had teachers ask me, "How are you still coming? This is ridiculous." Blah, 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 blah. I would ask Sharad, and he would say, "You're not ready. Your nervous system isn't ready," which I understood. And I still understand that in retrospect. And that said, there were many times where people felt that being taught new postures was being used as a kind of punishment or a kind of holding back the ego or a kind of punishment for other things. The bottom line is that there was no system even for that. The teachers created a system. We created a system in order to make sense of it. So the red flag here is that your boundaries of questioning the way in which new postures or the systems were taught or not wanting to be adjusted, your boundaries were ego, but the teacher's boundaries were sacred. And the last red flag is this kind of us versus them mentality. The world just doesn't understand what we're doing here. Critics are jealous or threatened by the truth. And this reminds me of a conversation that I had with one of my teachers. I was talking to him and I said, I think Ashtanga practitioners are the most hated practitioners of all the yoga systems because every time I tell someone that I'm an Ashtanga practitioner, I get a look. Or sometimes someone would be like, "Ugh." Uh, and I got it. I understood it. And his response was, "Oh, they're just jealous because we're so disciplined," or blah, blah, blah. So it was this us versus them mentality. Again, coming back to a few of the previous red flags, which were like leaving was seen as a spiritual failure, having boundaries or ego, uh, and that it's just not a choice. So these patterns, they don't happen overnight. They're gradual, and by the time you even notice, you've already been defending these things that you once would have questioned. I stayed in Ashtanga for decades, knowing what I knew, justifying it all. I was in a cult. It was what I had. It was what I needed at the time. And I told myself, I have a choice. I can leave anytime. This isn't a cult. But choice is an illusion when you've been conditioned to see questioning as ego, when you've been conditioned that gossiping is wrong, when you've been conditioned that leaving is a spiritual or physical failure or that you just don't get it, you're just not good enough to get it. Choice is an illusion when you've been conditioned and turned that whole community as your only world. So yeah, I had a choice in the same way that someone in an abusive relationship has a choice. Technically, yes, but practically, not so much. So if you see these signs in your studio, in your teacher training, in your Sangha, trust that feeling. It's not your ego, it's your wisdom. I stayed in it too long. I found myself in multiple different cults. I have written about these experiences in memoir format that I will be sharing on my podcast here in the next few days. But it let me be the what is that word? The cautionary tale. Don't do what I did. Anyway, that's all for today. Thanks so much. If you know of anyone who would benefit from this, please share, subscribe for more. Okay, talk soon. Bye.